A cold-hearted millionaire CEO thought it was just an ordinary day until he found an unconscious little girl on the street. He rushed her to the hospital, but when the truth about who she really was came out, his entire world shattered. Was this fate's way of giving him a second chance, or a punishment for his past mistakes? The late afternoon sun spilled gold across the skyscrapers of Manhattan, casting long shadows over the bustling streets where honking taxis battled for space with impatient drivers, and hurried footsteps echoed like a restless symphony of the city that never sleeps. Yet amid this chaos, Alexander Cole, a 32-year-old billionaire CEO, whose name dominated the financial world, emerged from the sleek black door of his luxury car, his sky-blue tailored suit catching the light with an authority that made strangers glance twice, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement with the confidence of a man used to power, respect and control. But in the very next second his entire universe shifted, for his eyes caught a sight that pierced through the armor of his arrogance and left him utterly motionless. A tiny figure sprawled on the cold concrete. A little girl no older than 5, her golden curls tangled against her pale cheeks, her small dress crumpled, her tiny fingers twitching weakly as though clinging to the last threads of strength. And for once, the man who built empires, crushed rivals, and negotiated billion-dollar deals found himself trembling, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering on the sidewalk forgotten, as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her fragile body, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he had never known before. "Hey, can you hear me?" he whispered desperately, his voice cracking, yet the child remained still, her blue eyes closed, her lips dry, her chest rising only with shallow uneven breaths that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. And in that moment the arrogant CEO vanished, replaced by a man kneeling in fear, his expensive suit scraping against dirty pavement as he scooped the girl gently into his arms, her lightness shocking him as though she had been carrying hunger and weakness for too long, her head falling against his chest as though seeking protection. And suddenly Alexander's carefully constructed world of glass towers and stock charts shattered under the weight of raw humanity pressing against him, for never had he held something so delicate, so breakable, and so hauntingly familiar, his usually steady hands trembling as though he feared the smallest movement might cost her the fragile life flickering within her. The cacophony of New York seemed to fade around him, horns and shouts dissolving into a distant hum, as his mind screamed at him to act, to do something, to save her before it was too late, and fumbling with his free hand, he grabbed his phone once more, dialing 911 with a shaky thumb, yet as the call connected and his voice broke into frantic urgency, he looked down again and his breath caught like ice in his throat, for the ambulance sirens had not yet wailed, the doctors had not yet appeared, and yet the sight before him stole all oxygen, the innocent face resting against his chest, the golden hair shimmering faintly in the dying sunlight, the curve of her lips, the delicate features etched with an uncanny resemblance that clawed at the locked chambers of his past, and though he shook his head violently, refusing to believe, a whisper deep within told him a truth too wild to grasp, that this unconscious child lying in his arms was not just a stranger, not just a helpless soul fate had thrown in his path, but someone who carried a piece of him. And as the camera of destiny zoomed closer upon her tiny face, Alexander Cole, billionaire, conqueror, untouchable force, felt the ground beneath his empire crumble with a single haunting question seared into his soul. Why does she look so familiar? The sharp cry of the ambulance siren cut through the Manhattan noise as Alexander clutched the little girl to his chest, climbing into the back with urgency that stripped away his usual air of control, and though the paramedics moved quickly, checking vitals and attaching oxygen, his gaze never left her pale face, every shallow rise and fall of her chest dragging him deeper into a fear he had never known. When they finally arrived at the emergency entrance, bright lights and shouting voices surrounded him, doctors rushing her through the double doors while he was forced to halt, his hands empty and trembling, his heart thundering in his ears, pacing the sterile corridor like a man stripped of direction. His mind racing with questions he couldn't answer, his usually polished composure cracking in front of strangers who whispered about the billionaire CEO looking more like a desperate father than a titan of industry. And when a nurse approached him with a clipboard and steady tone, "Sir, are you family?" Her words hung like a blade, forcing him to choose between truth and access, his hesitation heavy but brief as the fear of losing the child swallowed pride. "Yes, I'm her guardian," he lied, the words tasting foreign on his tongue yet oddly protective, and the nurse, convinced, simply nodded, pushing him forward into the world behind the curtain where machines beeped steadily and masked doctors hovered, their hands moving quickly over the tiny figure now lying motionless on a hospital bed, wires snaking across her chest, oxygen mask covering her fragile mouth, and Alexander froze at the sight, because here in this cold white room, all the armor of wealth and status dissolved, leaving only a man who had conquered boardrooms and dominated markets, but now stood powerless before a fragile heartbeat, his throat tightening as he whispered inwardly, "Don't you dare give up, little one, not now." Yet his words were drowned by the rhythmic beeping that seemed to slow each second, every sound stabbing into him like a reminder that money could not buy time, and as he pressed his hand against the glass, watching her tiny fingers twitch faintly against the sheet, a flood of memories hit him, not of this girl, but of mistakes, of roads not taken, of choices made for ambition over heart. And for the first time in years, Alexander Cole felt the full weight of regret claw at him, pacing like a caged animal, glancing at every passing doctor with pleading eyes, waiting for answers that never came quickly enough. Until at last a figure in a white coat entered the room where he was held back, his expression grave, his eyes locking on Alexander's, as though measuring whether this man could bear the truth, and Alexander's breath caught, palms slick, spine rigid, because in that single moment he knew his life was about to change forever, as the doctor cleared his throat and said softly but firmly, "Mr. Cole, there's something you need to know about this child." The weight in the doctor's voice froze Alexander in place, his breath shallow as he leaned forward to catch every word, and when the physician spoke, the clinical detachment of medical terms could not soften the blow. "She's severely dehydrated, underfed, but that's not all." And Alexander felt the world tilt because those words were not mere observations. They were accusations against fate, indictments against whoever had failed this child. Yet the doctor wasn't finished, his gaze somber, his words deliberate. "She has a rare condition that requires immediate attention, and without aggressive treatment she might not survive the next 48 hours. And the sharpness of those syllables sliced through Alexander's chest like glass, leaving him raw and exposed, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward, voice firm though trembling beneath. "Do whatever it takes, I don't care about the cost, money is not a problem." Because for the first time in years his wealth had a purpose beyond greed, beyond empire, beyond reputation, and he clutched the pen, scrawling his signature onto forms that blurred before his eyes, the ink shaking with urge. "NC." But then, as the paper slid away, something caught his attention, a glimmer against the child's frail chest, a delicate silver chain that seemed almost too fragile to exist, and his eyes narrowed, his breath halting as he reached with careful fingers, lifting a small locket that rested beneath the hospital gown, its surface scratched and worn, but still intact, still holding the secrets of a child too young to bear them, and with trembling hands he flicked it open, expecting perhaps a meaningless trinket, yet instead the universe mocked him with a truth he was not prepared for, because inside the tiny frame was not just any picture, but the face of a woman whose memory had haunted him for years, the woman whose laughter once lit the darkest nights, whose touch once made him believe in a world beyond business and ambition, the woman he had abandoned under the crushing weight of family pressure and ambition, and seeing her again, even in a photograph, ripped open wounds he had buried beneath layers of success and arrogance, his breath shuddering as his chest tightened, the hospital walls spinning around him, because the girl lying before him wasn't just a stranger, she carried proof of a past he thought he had erased, a bond he never imagined could exist, his hand shaking so violently that the locket slipped, swinging gently on its chain like a pendulum of fate, his lips parting with words that barely escaped as a whisper. "No, it can't be her." The denial crumbling into the sterile air, leaving him on the precipice of a truth that could unravel everything he thought he knew about his life, his choices, and his heart. His whispered denial still trembled in the sterile air, but as Alexander stared at the photograph tucked within the locket, memories surged like a flood breaking through a dam, dragging him backward into a time he had tried so hard to bury, back to when he was not the ruthless CEO feared in boardrooms, but a young man who had stumbled into love without warning, and her name had been Isabella Green, a woman whose very presence had softened his sharp edges, whose laughter had carried sunlight into his darkest days, a woman with gentle eyes that spoke of kindness rather than ambition, and though she came from a humble background, without wealth or pedigree, she had given him something far rarer, genuine love untainted by status or money. But his family had despised her, whispering at dinner tables that she wasn't worthy of him, that she would stain their name, their fortune, their legacy, and the pressure had grown unbearable. Every conversation laced with threats, ultimatums, and cruel reminders of responsibility, until the day came when his courage faltered, when he chose ambition over heart, wealth over love, walking away from the only woman who had ever truly seen him, leaving Isabella standing in the rain as he drove away, her eyes full of betrayal and heartbreak that still haunted his dreams. And though he built towers of glass and concrete, they could never shield him from the emptiness her absence carved inside him. Yet here, years later, fate twisted cruelly, because her face stared back at him from the locket of a child who clung to life, and the question he had buried under years of silence burned across his soul as he whispered shakily, "Isabella, did you have a daughter?" The words tasting of disbelief and guilt, because if this girl was truly hers, and if the resemblance was more than coincidence, then the bloodline connecting them might run far deeper than he dared admit. But before his thoughts could unravel fully, the sound of hurried footsteps snapped him back to the present, a nurse rushing into the room, eyes wide with urgency, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife. "Sir, the child is asking for her mother." Alexander stepped into the dimly lit room with the careful hesitance of a man walking into a fragile dream, his polished shoes silent against the tiled floor as the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the air, a sound both terrifying and comforting, reminding him that life still pulsed within the small body lying before him. And as his eyes adjusted, he saw her lashes tremble, her tiny chest rising and falling with uneven effort, until at last her eyes opened, twin pools of blue that seemed impossibly vast for someone so small, carrying a weight far beyond her years. And when her lips parted, dry and trembling, the words came out barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to pierce him through the ribs. "Where's Mommy?" And Alexander, the man who had stared down investors, critics, and rivals without flinching, felt a lump rise in his throat so thick he could barely breathe, because how could he answer when he himself was still grasping for the truth? So instead his instincts guided him where logic failed, his hand reaching out almost against his will to brush a curl of golden hair away from her clammy forehead, his voice unsteady as he leaned close and whispered softly, "Don't worry, sweetheart. You're safe now." The words trembling with a tenderness he hadn't summoned in years, words that felt both inadequate and absolute in the same breath, and as though clinging to the promise, the little girl's fragile hand reached out, curling around his much larger one with a strength that startled him, refusing to let go, her grip desperate, urgent, like someone drowning clutching for air, and Alexander froze, staring at the small fingers wrapped around his, the contrast almost unbearable, her innocence against his power, her weakness against his control, and in that instant something unexplainable sparked in him, a stirring that shook the foundations of who he was, because her touch did not feel like that of a stranger's. It felt known, it felt inevitable, as if some hidden part of him had always been waiting for this moment, and he tried to move slightly, to shift, but her grip only tightened, her knuckles whitening, her eyes fluttering closed again as though trusting him with her entire existence, and Alexander felt his heart tremble with an emotion he could not name, something between fear and love, between regret and hope, the sterile walls of the hospital fading away until all he could see was the delicate child clinging to him as though he was the only anchor she had left. And though he had built his life on keeping distance, on never allowing anyone to hold him, he found himself leaning closer, whispering without thinking, "I've got you, little one. I'm not going anywhere." And in the strange silence that followed, the man who had always believed vulnerability was weakness, realized that in this fragile grip he had found a strength he had never known, a mirror reflecting the hollowness of the empire he had built. And for a moment, he dared to imagine what it would be like if this bond meant something more than chance, if the thread pulling them together had been woven by fate long before this day. But before his thoughts could deepen, the door creaked open with a slow groan, pulling him harshly back into reality, and he turned sharply, his eyes locking on the doctor entering with a thick file pressed firmly to his chest, his expression grave, his steps measured, and Alexander's pulse spiked, his protective instinct flaring as he tightened his grip on the little girl's hand, unwilling to let her go even for the physician. And then, with a hesitation that only magnified the tension, the doctor's gaze settled on him, his voice low, but carrying the weight of revelation. "We found the girl's records." He paused, flipping the file open, his eyes narrowing slightly before meeting Alexander's again. "And you won't believe who her listed father is." Alexander's trembling fingers gripped the file so tightly it almost crumpled in his hands, his eyes racing over the damning words that burned into his soul. Father. Alexander Cole. And in that instant the sterile hospital room seemed to spin, his wreath caught in his throat as his knees buckled against the cold tile floor, the weight of truth pressing down like a storm he never saw coming, because the fragile little girl resting in the bed with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes that mirrored his own was not just a stranger fate had tossed into his life, but his daughter, the very child he had unknowingly abandoned when he walked away from Isabella years ago under the crushing weight of his family's judgment, and now every memory of that choice came flooding back with a vengeance. Isabella's trembling hands clutching his, her tearful pleas, his cold silence, the way she broke as he left her standing in the rain, all of it cutting deeper than a blade as guilt surged through his veins, twisting with regret and longing until his chest ached, because she had carried this secret alone, borne the burden without his support, and now the universe had shoved the truth in front of him when it was far too late to rewrite the past, leaving him staring at the fragile evidence of his mistake lying before him, her tiny hand clinging to his, like she had been waiting her whole life for this connection. And though he had not deserved her trust, something inside him ignited, a fierce, unshakable resolve that he would never again let go of what was his, that he would protect her with every breath in his body. But before the fire could settle, the nurse's voice sliced through the moment with chilling urgency, her words heavy with dread. "There's more. Her mother is missing, and time is running out." Alexander's world shifted the moment the nurse whispered those words about Isabella's disappearance, and from that instant he refused to waste even a second. He called in favors from old business partners, hired top-tier investigators, reached out to contacts in law enforcement, and poured money into every possible lead, his usually controlled demeanor replaced by raw desperation, because this wasn't just about finding a missing woman. It was about finding the mother of the child who had just unknowingly called him daddy, a word that had cracked his heart open and filled it with both unbearable guilt and a fierce new determination. And in between the frantic calls and endless meetings with investigators, Alexander never left the little girl's side for long, because every time he tried to step away, her small hand reached out instinctively, clutching at his sleeve with quiet fear. So he stayed, sometimes spending sleepless nights in the hospital chair, sometimes sitting cross-legged on her bed with a children's storybook in hand, reading aloud with a voice that softened in ways his boardroom rivals would never recognize, his free hand gently brushing her golden hair from her forehead, and when she struggled with food, he fed her spoon by spoon, whispering encouragement with each bite, reminding her that she was strong, that she was brave, that she was safe, even though he himself felt anything but safe inside his own skin, because the haunting truth of being her father, the father she had never known, was clawing at his conscience, asking why he hadn't been there before, why Isabella had borne this burden alone, why fate had stolen years he could never reclaim, and yet he forced himself to focus on the present, promising her in quiet whispers between her shallow breaths, "I won't leave you, not ever again," a vow that made his throat tighten each time he spoke it, because it wasn't just words, it was a penance, a desperate attempt to stitch together the years that guilt had torn apart. And when the little girl turned her head slightly, her blue eyes shining faintly through exhaustion, and whispered with a fragile smile, "You're nice. Like a daddy." Alexander felt his soul fracture and heal all at once, his eyes burning with tears that he quickly blinked away so she wouldn't see, because that small, innocent sentence carried the weight of a lifetime of absence and the miracle of a second chance. and he leaned forward, pressing a trembling kiss to her forehead, whispering back that yes, he was her daddy, and yes, he would prove it every day from this moment on, no matter the cost. And while she drifted back into a drowsy half-sleep, clutching his finger as if it were her lifeline, Alexander stepped outside briefly, pacing the hallway with the investigators' latest updates echoing in his ears, frustration mounting with every dead end, yet still refusing to let despair win, because his instincts screamed that Isabella was out there somewhere, scared and vulnerable, and he would not let his failures define the ending to her story or their daughters. So when his phone suddenly buzzed in his hand, his pulse spiked, breath catching as the caller ID flashed across the screen, one of his lead investigators on the line, and with a rush of dread and hope tangled together he pressed it to his ear, his voice tight as he demanded, "Tell me you found her." And for a moment the silence stretched too long, then came the words that froze his body in place and sent ice cascading through his veins. They had found Isabella, but not in the way he expected.